Welcome to the screencast for What is Knowledge by A.J. Ayer. This article starts on page 72 in our textbook. A.J. Ayer was a philosopher who lived from 1910 to 1989, and he was a major figure in a school of philosophy now known as either logical positivism or logical empiricism. And the logical empiricists believed that nothing in the world, nothing that we said, thought, or did had any meaning unless there was empirical evidence to verify or prove those beliefs. So when he was a young philosopher, he was influenced a lot by someone we've already read, Bertrand Russell. We read his article, The Value of Philosophy, and we're going to read another one of his articles pretty soon, Appearance and Reality. And he was also influenced by another empiricist British philosopher, G.E. Moore. One of the most influential things from Russell to Ayer, A.J. Ayer, the one we're going to read today, is a quote that said something close to this. It is undesirable to believe a proposition when there is no ground for believing its truth. So when we say the word grounds or ground for a proposition or a sentence or a belief, philosophers have technical differentiation to say what the difference between those things are. But for us, we only really have to worry that they're really close. When we make a statement about a belief or a sentence or a proposition, it's all a different, perhaps it's a different way of expressing whatever it is that we think is true or not true. So Bertrand Russell said, if you're trying to decide whether or not to believe something, you should only accept evidence where there's a good ground for it. Now, G.E. Moore talked about what he names the naturalistic fallacy. And what that fallacy boils down to is the idea that it seems impossible to describe goodness in the world using scientific or empirical facts. And when philosophers talk about something as generic as goodness, they mean something like all morality. We think that the world is good when it's a certain way and bad when it's another. So we might think that the rule of law is good and the absence of that is bad. And G.E. Moore was wondering how we could use scientific or empirical facts. And remember, all the way back to the beginning of the screencast, we talked about what an empirical fact is. Something that can be sensed with our senses directed toward the outside world, not something that we come up with logically or emotionally. So how is it, Moore thought, that we could have a concept like good in the world and explain it using facts that we measure about our brains or about even the way the world is outside? He didn't think it was possible. So if we're going to go back and we're going to try and be logical empiricists, where we shouldn't believe in propositions that we don't have good evidence for, that makes all of morality kind of iffy or shaky for its evidential grounds. How could we get to the point where we can make morality an area where we can have knowledge, not just feelings about it, if it's going to be difficult to describe goodness by only using scientific facts? That's just a little bit of background that I want you to keep in your head, that because Ayer was this guy that was trying to demonstrate that the subject matter of philosophy has to stick to the realms that have good observable evidence, even if you're using logic. So over the millennia, thousands of years, remember when Plato was writing, it was a couple hundred BCE. From then all the way up until when Ayer was writing, philosophers had tried to elucidate or figure out what it is that differentiates knowledge from other types of beliefs. So in all that time, a standard definition was developed, and that was 1, that you're sure of the belief, 2, what you are sure of is true, and 3, you have a right to be sure of it. So the first one, all that means is that you hold the belief. You are convinced inside your head that whatever belief X is true. The second one means whatever you happen to believe inside your head matches somehow the outside world, and that means that it's true. And the third criteria is that you have the proper evidence to be convinced. You've gone through the right sort of process to ensure that the evidence lends enough support to the beliefs. So if you hear the phrase justified true belief, that is a shortcut to saying this traditional definition of philosophy. Because it's a belief, it's true, and justification means that you have enough evidence. So this is our traditional definition of knowledge that we're going to work with throughout this article. So in the argument, Ayer uses his positivist or empiricist leanings to describe the traditional definition of knowledge, why we need it, and why it's good enough to count as knowledge. So again, we're trying to figure out why a belief might be elevated from the realm of all the other different things we think and feel. Mere, quote-unquote, facts, just disconnected facts that you might run into, wrong beliefs that you might have, opinions that you might have, preferences that you might have. We all intuitively feel like those things are different to knowledge when we actually know something, but we want to articulate why. So over time, they've built up this 3-part definition. So in the rest of the lecture and in the rest of the article, Ayer tries to prove to us that he has enough evidence to convince us that this is an adequate definition of knowledge. You might wonder why we need a definition of knowledge. I want you to think back to our last few articles about why clear definitions are important, those intellectual values that we need to get as close to the truth or the best supported beliefs that we can, and how one means of doing that is to be as clear as possible about what we mean when we articulate what we believe. So this first criteria in the article, like I said, it's justified true belief. So we'll start with the second one, the truth. So whatever it is we want to believe, of course we want to believe that it's true. We can dig deeper, and philosophers have, to try and figure out what we mean when we say that something is true, but for our purposes right now, we don't really need much more than our commonplace understanding of what truth is. Now, it seems like when we say something is true, we mean that our sentences match some state of affairs in the world or in our minds. So that or right there should be an or. And here's an example. Here's something external. George Washington was the first president of the United States. George Washington was not the first president of the United States. So since they're contradictory, one of them is true and one of them is false. We think the first one is true because it matches a state of affair outside in the world. How might we know that? Historical evidence, documentation, etc. But for now, all we need to worry is that one or the other of those matches the way the world is. And the second one is the internal thing. So now there's a state of affair inside our heads and our bodies. And one is true and the other one is false because it matches the state of affairs that's in the world. So, okay, if we have a belief like this, either the George Washington one, external, or the I am sad one, internal, so should that just count as knowledge? It's true. And Ayer is going to say no. It's not enough that something matches the state of affairs in the world. And one of the reasons, of course, is because There's a lot of states of affairs out in the world and inside our heads and bodies as well. We don't know about all of it. Any one person never knows every single thing about the way the world is and was and will be. So there are lots of things that we don't know. And since we're concerned about knowledge, something being true isn't enough. We also need to believe it. So now this is our second criteria in the shortened phrase, justified true belief. Now we're on belief. So just being true doesn't have anything to do with how people and human beings acquire knowledge. You also need to believe it. You have to have the sentence, the proposition, or the claim inside your head, and you have to think that it's true. So now we know that the thing is true, the sentence or the proposition or the claim or and we also believe it. It's become a belief. And now all we have to worry about is the third condition. Why is it important? So first, Ayer gives us a couple of examples, as to why only having the first two conditions isn't enough. So you might imagine someone's superstitious, and they walk underneath a ladder, so they think that something bad is going to happen to them. And it might be the case that something bad happens to them very close to the time that they walked under a ladder. So it's true that it happened, and they believed it. Yet, most of us would not be inclined to say that walking under the ladder is what caused whatever bad thing to happen. Maybe they lost a job or got sick. Doesn't matter what it is. So something bad happened, it was true, and they believed it. But the causal story, remember causal reasoning, saying A caused B, it just doesn't hold up. So their reasoning is not reliable. So we need that right kind of justification, the right kind of reasons and evidence in order for something to count as knowledge. Now that one, if you believe in being reasonable with your beliefs, the example of someone superstitious might not be all that convincing that you need the right kind of justification in every case. Because if you're a generally reasonable person and you only accept things that have been demonstrated, processes that have been demonstrated to be reliable, like mathematical reasoning, logic, science, you can still make mistakes with justification. So here's another example. A person is shown a proof for a mathematical formula. So anytime you've taken a math class, you know that they'll show you why that the formula is correct, and that's called the proof of the formula. Now, say that formula happens to actually be true. And so when the person looks at this proof, they say, oh, okay, this formula is true, and I got reasonable evidence to believe that it's true. So they would think that they had justified true belief. But also imagine that the proof happens to be incorrect. The formula is still true, somebody just made a mistake when they wrote it down. So it seems like knowledge, but the evidence is still unreliable. So from this thought experiment or example, Ayer wants us to always ask ourselves when we're questioning a belief. It wants us to have a good answer to the question, how do you know? So of course, this gets to the nitty-gritty of something that people struggle with all the time. What counts as good evidence and what counts as bad evidence? So first we can classify the general types of evidence we use when we decide whether or not to believe something. We use our direct perception, sight, smell, taste, touch, etc. We listen to the testimony of others, and we know that some people's testimonies are more reliable than others. So if a physicist tries to tell you about biology, they might be a smart, perceptive person, but their testimony is going to count less than a biologist giving us information about biology. Our memory, of course, is a part of the set of evidence that we use to believe certain things, the historical record, scientific laws. But okay, if you're put into a specific context where you have to choose whether or not to believe something specific, how do we know what mixture of these things counts as enough to be rigorous enough to bring it up from the level of opinion to the level of knowledge? Is there even a difference between knowledge and true belief if we know that sometimes all these types of evidence can be wrong? They can be erroneous. We can make mistakes. Not to mention that sometimes the answer to the question, how do we know? That's the question I'm referring to here. Isn't easily available, or it's unavailable altogether. So now he has an example of somebody who's really good at predicting lottery numbers. They say they have an intuition for it, not a method at all. Or maybe they don't have a rational method. They just go by their emotions. And now he says, and this is this logical positivist that only wants to accept evidence that we can sense. He says this on page 74. Normally, we do not say that people know things unless they've followed one of the accredited routes to knowledge. So remember all those pieces of evidence we have in the back, or in the last slide, that we could weigh and decide. If someone reaches a true conclusion without appearing to have any adequate basis for it, we're likely to say that he doesn't really know it. So, say this lottery person predicts the lottery numbers better than 50% of the time. Maybe not 100% of the time. And they don't really have a method. So are we going to say right here, right now, that that person, using whatever path they choose, actually has knowledge of the lottery numbers? And this is the part where it gets pretty murky for Ayer. So if he were repeatedly successful in a given domain, we might very well come to say that he knew the facts in question, even though we could not explain how he knew them. So, okay, what should we take away from his arguments? We talked about the truth part, the belief part, and the justification part. And that very last part was a little less certain than the other two, the arguments that he used. And you always want to ask yourself this question. If he wants us to ask, how do you know, when you're deciding about a belief, I want you to always ask, what should we take away from the argument that we've just read or heard about? It's a really good way to help increase your skills of comprehension. So he wants knowledge to only count as knowledge if someone can demonstrate how or why they got that knowledge. I have his positivism in the question bracket behind there, because someone who's not a positivist might think that that's irrelevant, that not every piece of evidence has to be demonstrable to our senses or empirically in order to count as knowledge. But he does concede at the very end that consistency in prediction, so that lottery guy, of future events must count as evidence because it's successful. Even if we can't explain why it's successful. If you push it a step further, you're going to realize that that still counts as empirical, because the predictions themselves can count as something that we sense. So if somebody's making really good guesses and they can't explain why, then we can count their success as empirical evidence or justification to elevate our beliefs into knowledge. So thus at the end, Ayer says that we've shown how all three criteria are necessary to claim that any one specific belief that we hold isn't just a belief, it's also knowledge about the world or about ourselves.